Hello and welcome. My name is Carolina Kaufman, and I'm the Director of Education and Engagement at the Pentacrest Museums. We're delighted to welcome you today to the exhibition Spotlight, Valuing the Ancient in the Modern World, which is the last in this webinar series that explores themes from our current exhibit, Then and Now, 175 Years at the Pentacrest at the Old Capitol Museum. It honors the university's landmark anniversary, exploring the evolution of various departments on campus, one which we are honored to have with us today. Serving to strengthen the vital role of the museums in the educational research and engagement missions of the university, the Pentacrest Museums enhance the campus-wide focus on cultural and environmental diversity. The exhibit and exhibition program we are presenting you today has been made possible by the hard work of the staff at the Pentacrest Museums and its partners. We especially want to extend our gratitude to the Office of the Provost, whose support makes all the museum's work and exhibits possible. Thank you. I'm honored to serve as your moderator today, and with us, I'm excited to introduce our special guests. I want to welcome John Dorshuk. Dr. Dorshuk is an archaeologist who works at the University of Iowa in the role of the State Archaeologist of Iowa, directing the Office of the State Archaeologist, a research center on campus established in 1959. Dr. Dorshuk's research on Iowa and mid-continental archaeology spans all time periods and cultural adaptations. In addition to working with both undergraduate and graduate students on campus, Dr. Dorshuk's work through the OSA includes frequent consultation with American Indian tribal representatives and state and federal agency representatives involved with historic preservation and compliance issues. Welcome, John. I also want to welcome Suzanne Wanatee Buffalo. Suzanne is the Senior Deputy Clerk at the Meskwaki Tribal Court. She has worked for the Meskwaki Tribal Court and for Justice Services since 2007, holding an Advanced Tribal Court Clerk certification and is NCIC certified at the Department of Justice. Since 2014, Suzanne has served on the Iowa Office of the State Archaeologist Indian Advisory Council. Suzanne is a member of the Sauk and Fok tribe of the Mississippi in Iowa, the Meskwaki Nation, and lives on the Meskwaki Indian settlement in Tama, Iowa, with her husband, Jonathan L. Buffalo. Welcome. And finally, I want to present to you Laura Noldner. Laura Noldner is the Bioarchaeology Director at the University of Iowa at the Office of the State Archaeologist. Her primary responsibility is seeing to the protection of ancient human remains and burial sites in Iowa. This means working closely with Native American advisors, documenting known burial sites, investigating inadvertent discoveries of ancient human skeletal remains, facilitating repatriations and reburials with descendant communities, and working with developers so that known burial sites are not disturbed by construction projects. Thank you for being here, everybody. As we commemorate and examine the history of our university and the land it sits upon, it's important to reflect and remember with gratitude and respect what this land has meant to people over the course of human history, long before the university was present, and which many nations of indigenous people have lived, fought for, and continue to thrive today, as you see here in the state of Iowa throughout the Midwest. There is a long story, and there's a long story of treaties and forced removals that dispossessed these people of their land. The 20 tribes listed here are sovereign nations which we know have historical associations in the state of Iowa. They did not disappear. They're still around and continue to maintain their connections here. It's important to know their names. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, understanding the historical and current experiences of Native people will help inform the work we do collectively as a university to engage in building relationships through academic scholarships, collaborative partnerships, community service, enrollment and retention efforts, acknowledging our past, present, and future Native nations. We actively do this today, such as providing intuition for Native Nation people, for example, of one of many. In our program today, and with that in mind, to reflect upon the land we stand on, we will look at the evolution and history of archaeology in Iowa. And we'll also learn about how the field has changed and how it values and works with Indigenous people and communities. We'll also discover both past and modern practices of archaeology into the 21st century. I'm excited to show this slide because it shows an interesting comparison, which I will help introduce, but allow Suzanne Wanatee Buffalo to take the mic to talk about the presence of people in Iowa and how long they've been here. And this is an interesting map and also an image to the right of what Iowa, in terms of the landscape, used to look like. Suzanne, would you like to share more about what we're looking at here today?
Yes, Carolina, thank you. And it's a great honor to be here today. This is a subject that means a lot to me and means a lot to a lot of Native people throughout the country. Our land here in Iowa has been much changed. Right now, we look out and we see a lot of agricultural farmland, but it hasn't always looked that way. Some of the animals that used to be here in Iowa aren't here anymore. Those fairly recently, actually. So that's one of the things that just now, I think I read an article about mountain lions being seen and things like that. And those were fairly common for quite a few years. But the map here was created by an Iowa chief, not Meskwaki. I'm from the Meskwaki tribe. We're in central Iowa and Tama County. And this chief did a really good job making a map. It's called the No Heart map. And it showed all of their travel routes, a lot of their population here in Iowa, and a number of tribes had known villages, known trade routes, known maple syrup camps, hunting areas. This was a very much loved part of the country. A lot of valuable natural resources here. But one of the things I'd like to back up a little bit farther than the map and talk about our presence here as an Indigenous people in this country. I think a lot of Americans have this notion that the land was wide open. It was a new world, and they equate that with being an empty world. And there's a number of things to keep in mind about how those views have affected how we see how Native Americans are seen today. So for example, Native Americans have been here a long time. And to give some context to that, we remember mammoths. So when you think of prehistoric animals that aren't around anymore, Native Americans we were contemporary with those creatures that only appear in history books. And no one actually sees walking around anymore. And yet here we are walking around. So our ancientness, our ancient connection to this land goes a long ways back. We're not new immigrants. And that's one of the things I think people have a difficult time of getting a sense of occupation in an area. And we have had ancient civilizations here that were highly civilized, highly organized in the Americas, North America, Central America, South America, for tens of thousands of years. We were old when the pyramids were just starting to get built. So that's our historic connection to this land. We remember the glacier. We remember the changes the land has gone through. So our memory and our connection to this land is ancient, and we are the ancients that are still here, and we're shopping in Walmart, and we're driving cars, and our kids go to school, but we bring our ancientness with us to this day. We haven't left it behind. We aren't trying to be like everybody else. We are ancient people in a modern world. And I think another thing to remember is the impacts that have happened to our communities and how significant those impacts were. So a lot of folks think of the Black Death in Europe, and it's often called the world's most devastating plague outbreak. And it killed half of Europe's population in the space of about 7 years in 1350. And you hear stories about the Black Death and the plague and how awful that was. So it killed 50% of Europe's population. That's just Europe. But nobody remembers about the impact that European diseases had on Native Americans. And there's really from about 1492 really to present, but especially the first 100 years, estimates are anywhere between 95% and 98% of the Native American, the indigenous populations in the Western Hemisphere died because of that exposure to those diseases. And so that's what's called a demographic collapse of the indigenous population. And when you have such a significant thing like that, we really see it as that was our apocalypse. And we're still we're in our post-apocalypse right now. We haven't really recovered from that. So this has had an enormous impact on how we related to each other and trying to recover and getting this introduction of this new settler populations coming into different parts of the country. But it also helps to explain why some people, when they came from Europe and settled in the Americas, they saw what they perceived to be this open land. But there'd been about 100 years that had passed from the time of the introduction of the disease, and it rolled across the landscape, wiped many Native American communities out. And by the time the settler population started arriving, things were overgrown, our roads were overgrown, our villages looked like they were either old or abandoned or non-existent even. So I think that contributed to the perception that this was an empty land and that we weren't highly civilized because we had just come through basically an apocalypse. So, and I think it's important when we look at today and we're looking at how did we get to this point today, we have to put everything in context and understand that when Native Americans are talking about their past connection to their land, and like the map shows where villages were, this is something that we know to be true. It might not appear in a history book that someone else wrote down because many people who were documenting history in the United States, Central America, South America, they weren't really looking to document our history. They were looking to document trade routes, existing populations, natural resources. These weren't a bunch of history professors that showed up, or ethnographers, or even archaeologists, because those professions didn't exist at the time. So the people who made a lot of the initial contact with native populations were there for their own purposes. They were there to discover and then utilize natural resources. They were there to, of the populations they did meet, they were there to convert them to a different religion. So there was, I think a lot of Americans today think that there was this studious and respectful view that was taken at these first contact meetings, and that's not necessarily the case. So some of the history that was written down was told from an economic perspective. It was told from a political perspective. It wasn't necessarily, didn't do a very good job of capturing the vitality, the significance, the deep knowledge that a lot of these tribes have of their natural environment. And when we would relate our stories of an area, it was called mythology or oral history, which is true, but there's a lot of science in what we know. We've lived here a long time. You can't stay alive in a certain area without understanding what plants can kill you and what plants are safe to eat, what can be used as medicine. And that is technology, that is science, learning how to hunt with different things, hunting different types of creatures, knowing the natural processes. This is all very, very profoundly important scientific information. So when things have been written down about tribes, really up until fairly recently, we've often been reduced to being a very backward, childlike, simple type of groups of people who were like on the bottom level of civilization, and everybody else was supposed to be up above. And I don't think that our complexity has really ever been appreciated by many disciplines in academics. So that's why I'm particularly happy to be here, is because I want to remind people, first right off the bat, that some of the views that have been taken about natives we saw it as coming from a very simple view, but were complicated. So taking the steps necessary, really talking to people, really engaging, really listening, and understanding the value those people have, local people have to their way of life and their world is really important to do, no matter where we go in the world. If I go to a different part of the world, I shouldn't show up with the expectation that I know more than they do, or that they're not significant. Clearly, they have a deep connection there, and I should be respectful of it. So one of the views, for example, of the river, we see a lot of land manipulation that has happened, especially in the Midwest, where a lot of dikes have been put up. Everybody's trying to utilize the agricultural fields and the land for as much opportunity as they can. So Corps of Engineers came in, put a bunch of dikes in, tiling. They put tile in to drain the swamps and the wetlands, and in order to use the land to grow crops, make money, that type of thing. And what's happened is, in many cases throughout the Midwest, those practices have caused flooding to be extremely bad. If the river can't move, it will speed up. If you get a large weather event, if there's no wetlands to absorb that, it's going to cause devastation. If you have cities built right next to the river edge, it it changes the types of creatures that can live on the land. And I think that's something that native populations, regardless of where they live, understand the value of these and see the world in systems. This isn't just a river. There's a whole ecosystem there, and there's a whole natural process that happens. And I think that that opportunity was missed to gather that information. And we're trying to catch up now, where native populations are trying to, some of them who were moved away from their natural, where they normally were at, their homeland or their bioregion, they are also trying to reconnect. Again, they're still trying to recover from not only that, that disease, Holocaust really that happened, but then also removal and alienation and war, more diseases that happen. So a lot of our Native American tribes are still in recovery. Nobody has reached their population levels again, and they're trying to rebuild, and in some cases get refamiliarized with a land that they've become alienated from, either through space, geographical distance, or from time. So you see the land that we're living on today here in Iowa is significant. It still is significant. And while you might not look out and see, like this map, all of these Iowa villages all over Iowa, it is still very meaningful to many Native American tribes. Whether you see them here or not, their connection to this land goes very deep, and they don't have any intention of forgetting it and moving on. So I'm happy to take that opportunity to throw that in there.
Suzanne, I really actually want to interject, and I appreciate sort of this historical context from the Native lens, because I think these two images kind of exemplify a little bit of that sort of, where was the translation lost in terms of what settlers or later explorers or earlier explorers understood the land and how they interpreted that land versus the way Native people interpreted that land. You mentioned a system. I really love that, because I think a lot about sort of this map serving as like that open system, right? It changes, it moves, it grows. This is encompassing actually a 250 to 300 year period, not just a one-time map, right? View of a map, the way most European maps are like, at this moment, this is what this map looked like. This was not the view of the Native perspective. And I really appreciate hearing this. I think it could help us think more, be more cognizant of how we've learned our histories, and what does it mean? What does that mean to us? Like, what does the land mean to you versus the way it's been traditionally sort of taught, or in the majority. I would like to move on the sake of time, but to that point, thinking about that lost in translation, this is an example, and I'd love for you to share more about the early sort of perspective of Europeans when it came to Native peoples' sacred places and burials.
Right. So this goes back again to the idea that this was an empty land when Western Europeans started showing up to settle. And in many cases, tribes were moved off in advance, sometimes in a very short period of time in advance. And Chief Powashik, who is Meskwaki, was very eloquent, and this is what he said: as our tribe, as like many tribes, were being moved out of a territory that was being turned into a state, so it would later become the state of Iowa. This was in 1838. We got moved off along with a number of tribes, including the Sac. So we're the Fox part. There's the Sac and Fox tribe. There's the Saugis, which is the Sac, and there's the Fox, which is the Meskwaki. So they're two different tribes. But in as punishment for the Black Hawk War, which in our mind really wasn't a war, but it was treated as such, and we got disciplined for it. We were kicked out of Iowa, politically anyway, forced to sign some treaties, and Chief Powashik made it known. He said, "You, meaning the incoming settlers, will plant corn where my dead sleep." So even with that opening statement, he's saying just as anybody would say, my grandmother's buried there, my great grandfather is buried there. We connect ourselves with place, and he was aware that we're not abandoning our people. We're being forced to move, and he could see the writing on the wall, as most Native Americans could. We get it. You're gonna move into the place that we lived in because it was a great place to live, and you're gonna take over our paths, and they'll become your paths, and what's going to happen is he's saying, I know I must go far away, and you will be so glad when I'm gone. I get it. You want me gone. You're going to be happy when I'm gone. You're going to soon forget that we lived here, and you're going to forget that if a stranger showed up at our house, the first thing that we always do is feed someone. If someone shows up, they're going to be hungry if they're a traveler. In order to be respectful and be a good host, you welcome people in, you take care of them. If someone shows up on your doorstep, you don't turn them away with starving children and say, you're not my problem. We've seen refugees before, and that's what we were taught, is that you take care of people who need help. And all we've ever asked was for the right to be free, is what Powashik is saying. So this is what he's saying to the people, to the incoming people who are kicking us out.
Mm-hmm.
I just quickly interject too. This is it was a quote that the advisory council asked that we put up in the my lab here, where the ancient human remains are reposed. So nice humbling reminder, and something that we always point to whenever we have members of the public come in.
Thank you for sharing that, Laura. I think that's very significant, especially for students and people that are learning in the field. That's great.
Oh, okay. And then here's something a little bit more about the history of back in when right about the time I was becoming a state. This is just a couple years after Chief Powashik gave his sad statement about leaving. So the son of Chief Black Hawk, who was in the Black Hawk War, they found out Black Hawk was a Sac chief, and he died, and someone went and dug him up, and the son was very unhappy about it. So the idea of digging up dead Indians natives have never liked it. We're not for it. We think it's bad if it's a recently dead or a dead that's been around a long time. So I want people to keep in mind that the view of Native Americans in the modern world is it's just as bad to dig up someone. We don't think you should be digging up people. We don't care what color they are, what culture they come from. We don't think that's good to do. And we're on record as saying, look, we resist our dead getting dug up in the first place, whether it's a recent dead or if it's someone we knew or personally were related to them. But in this particular case, it was the son of Black Hawk. And he went to the governor of, it was then a territory. And he's saying, we want answers. Who's done this? They've come and done this, and we don't know what to do. So they turned to the territorial governor of Iowa. Which one of your people would do this to my father, is what he's saying. And if we go to the next slide. So Chief Black Hawk died of malaria in 1938, and he's buried near Old Iowaville, which is on the north side of the Des Moines River in southeastern Iowa. So the capital, Iowa's had a number of different capitals, and that was in one area. So Dr. James Turner, doctors at that time, you couldn't do autopsies on anyone who was Christian. So as they're learning about their profession, how the body worked, they would take bodies of condemned prisoners who were condemned to die. And then they would also dig up anyone who wasn't Christian. They find out that someone was buried, they dig them up. They would take the body to study for an autopsy. They would take the grave goods off of the body, and they would give that to, so they take the body for the medical purposes, usually in a higher institution like a university or something. And then they would alienate, they would disassociate the clothing that the person was buried on or any items they were buried with, and they would give that to the museum part. So many natives that were disinterred, what we would call grave robbing, many of the items that you used to see in museums actually came off of a deceased Native American. So Dr. James Turner is the one that came out with the great idea that he not only could do an autopsy, he knew where he was buried, and then he'd also put the head on display and charge people a fee to view it. This is a doctor. This isn't, some guy, this isn't a farmer or anything like that. This is a doctor of the time. We can go to the next slide. So he dug up his body and he severed the head, and he spent the next afternoon cooking the flesh off of Black Hawk's skull in his brother's family kitchen. And Black Hawk's head ended up being displayed in a store in the front window on Burlington's Main Street for a great number of years, until the building thankfully burnt to the ground. Now, it sounds horrible, but if you go to the next slide, and this is to let people know, when natives talk about something like this, our non-native audience think we're making this stuff up, and we're not. This was an account. How do I know this happened? How do I know that his head got cooked up on the stove? It was because his sister-in-law put it in a book and wrote about it. And it was a fairly, she thought it was, a bad idea. But this wasn't anything that anyone went to jail for. There were no consequences to something like this. However, if you go to the next slide. Oh, I guess we don't have it. So there's a piece in there where they had gone to the governor of the territory complaining about this situation. And the governor said, we agree, that's bad. We don't think that should happen to anybody, regardless of whether they're Native American or white or anything else. So this situation shows really the first time that Native American group in Iowa went to the political leadership, particularly the governor, and said, help, what are you going to do about this? This is wrong. And the governor said, you're right, this is wrong. We do not think this is a good thing to do. So Iowa has this remarkable history. You have to remember, at the same time in California, they have a bounty out on Native Americans' ears and adults, men, women, children, old people. And the gold rush is just starting to happen. The 49ers, California did some horrible, horrible things to the tribes that lived in that area. California isn't the only one, but that's just an example I'm using. Contemporarily, we're talking about Iowa as a state going, oh my gosh, the governor saying, no, we think this is bad. And then you've got other states that have a completely different view of that. So while Iowa wasn't protecting Indians everywhere, it had an awareness, it had a familiarity. We felt like we could go to the governor and complain, whereas many other states, that route wasn't available to those tribes because they would either get killed or those territories just moved their Indians completely away. So they couldn't go back and complain because they were kicked out.
I guess I can jump in at this point. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being with us today. As Suzanne has richly documented, a history of archaeology in Iowa is primarily about Native American peoples and their experiences and lifeways. To put some sort of chronology on that, the very earliest indicators we have of any presence of non-native peoples in the state, it's about 350 years old, that kind of time depth, 3 centuries plus. But for Native Americans, it's on the order of at least 13,000 years using archaeological data. The oral histories and other information that Suzanne mentioned, of course, might push that even deeper, and we just haven't found it archaeologically yet. I included this map because it's an extrapolation of the Nohart map that we had up previously, which has been subjected to modern cartographic techniques to essentially rubber sheet it, as they call it, onto a modern topography that you might be more familiar with. In the center there, you can see the state of Iowa probably pretty clearly. And the black lines are the lines from the Nohart map, stretched to fit based on his written descriptions of what was on that map. So that native cartography looked at the world in a different way than we do spatially. But it turns out that it maps very neatly onto the Mississippi and the Missouri and some of the other major waterways. The lettered numbers are mapped villages from the Iowa map. The red triangles are archaeological sites of the Oneota culture, which is the term that archaeologists use for the ancestral Iowa that are today known as the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska and the Iowa tribe of Oklahoma, the descendant populations of the Oneota culture archaeologically and of Nohart and his colleagues in the 1830s. So you can see there's even some correspondence between archaeological sites and some of these Oneota sites. So we have in some places high confidence levels that we've been able to archaeologically link to what Nohart was talking about. So unfortunately, at the time in 1837, Nohart's map wasn't given the credence it should have been by the US government. It complicated some of the land claims that the Iowa were trying to pursue. They ended up getting moved out of state and left behind the Meskwaki, who were more successful in keeping their toehold and increasing their population here. But the Iowa people of today are very concerned about archaeology in Iowa, and we regularly consult with them, and they collaborate with us on various projects. So we can go to the next slide, I think. I included these two to show a more Western European, non-Indian view of that same landscape. On the left-hand side, in 1718, a map maker named Delisle used information compiled from fur traders and trappers, missionaries, soldiers, some of the folks who were coming into this territory for the first time, to build this map that you can see has the chemin de voyageurs on it, the route of the fur traders going from the Mississippi on the right across all the way to the Missouri, and crossing through an area that is known today as Iowa Great Lakes, where a village of the Iowa is prominently displayed there on the map. On the right-hand side of the map, the mine diplome is the lead mines that the Meskwakis were operating long before Europeans ever arrived in this area, but those were taken over by Julian Dubuque and others. Interestingly, less than 100 years later, on the right-hand side, one of the first American-made maps of the same area shows a degradation of understanding of the landscape. The chemin de voyageurs has been demoted to a dotted line path that leads out to some vague space in the middle of this white space on the map. The Ajus is a term for the Iowa. So they still knew that there were Indians out there at the end of that path, but their understanding really of the landscape was much degraded from their earlier European ancestors, which is an interesting thing. But it explains a lot about why there was this concept of open landscape, that this was an area that could just be taken over by settling populations moving in. What we see today is a very colonial enterprise, but then was seen as opportunistic and even their right, which is a product of a different time. But archaeology then is very much an exercise in looking past historic data and historic maps and looking at what evidence is still preserved. And what we find when we look is that what Suzanne says is exactly right. There was a long, long history of complicated adaptations to the natural world that was done very, very successfully. And I think one of the fascinations that modern archaeologists have with the past is how did people successfully survive without the technologies we have today? And Iowa is a great laboratory for that. Why don't we go to the next slide? You want to jump in on this one, Laura?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this map is showing essentially, I think it speaks to a couple things that Suzanne pointed out. Is the great removal of Native communities from this area, but it's basically showing all of the, how farly dispersed they are now. But this is basically indicating all of the tribes that are signatory to our agreement with NAGPRA on the disposition of culturally unidentified remains. So for individuals that we can't trace to a subset of descendant communities, we essentially consult with all of these folks. And I would say even for other development projects and consultation that agencies need to do, we distribute the list of these tribes. These are the folks you need to contact for any issues here in Iowa. So I think, yeah, it's kind of, yeah, telling of that removal, but also that a lot of the work we do is with a lot of Native communities today.
Yeah, and that speaks to the fact that modern archaeology is not just about scientists studying some ancient thing that happened, but it's the collaboration with the modern descendants of those peoples that really defines what current archaeology is all about. I want to just take a quick minute or two to introduce folks if they're not familiar with the Office of the State Archaeologist at the University of Iowa. This is our building on the left-hand side. The Clinton Street building used to be an A&P grocery store for a long time before the university purchased it and converted it for us. Eventually, we moved in 1998, so we've been here quite a long time now from our perspective. It allowed us to consolidate all our operations into one place that had been dispersed across campus prior to that. But we have several Iowa code mandated responsibilities that form the basis for what we do in Iowa. And on top of that, then we layer our research activities as a research unit at the university. First and foremost of those responsibilities is the protection of ancient human remains. Iowa was, if not the first, among the first states in the union to have a code section that specifically protects ancient human remains. So we're proud of that legacy. We also keep track of where all known archaeological sites are. We're up to about 31,000 plus recorded archaeological sites. We know there's lots more of those. We run into private collectors all the time who sometimes will share with us where they're finding materials. So that number grows both by contributions by private citizens and also by our various field activities that the office conducts and other consulting firms conduct. So we do research on the past, we investigate, we document. We are the State Archaeological Repository, which includes a large archive as well. We have over 300,000 documents on Iowa archaeology digitized now and preserved, along with materials from about 14,000 of those recorded sites are here stored in the building for research purposes by appointment. Researchers or other folks interested in the past can come and look at materials, and all that is very well organized and maintained by our staff. And then we also have an important education role across the state, and our education and outreach folks are working tirelessly to increase the public's understanding about the past and to respect it as well. Okay, go ahead with the next one. One of the tools that is used, a technology, we mentioned earlier in the program that we wanted to touch on some of the technological changes in Iowa archaeology that have taken place. One of the major tools that is used in historic preservation efforts involving Iowa archaeology is what's called iSites. And iSites, there is a public version of iSites which is available on the Iowa State University GIS server. You can track that down. The link is also on the OSA website. And that shows where sites have been found, but only based on a 1 square mile distribution across the state. iSites Pro is the tool that's used by those who have meet the qualifications as a professional archaeologist, or a collaborating tribal historic preservation office member. The State Historic Preservation Office uses this. Other agencies that are involved with historic preservation use this. And this shows precisely where these sites are found and related information associated with them. Go to the next slide, if you would. So this is a shot zoomed all the way out. This is all 31,000 sites represented as dots. The red dots are those that have human remains of some sort associated with them. So those we flag, literally red flag them as special locations that we pay particular attention to. As you zoom in iSites Pro, you can see more precisely the details of landscape, soils, hydrology, associated other cultural records, which are all used in the management of these archaeological sites across the state. Okay, go ahead to the next slide.
Incredible view.
Yeah.
Incredible view, John.
Go to the next one. Okay, I'll let Laura jump in on this.
Yeah, so a lot of those sites that John was just pointing out are burial sites, and they are protected under Iowa code from intentional disturbance now as of 1976. So this slide, I kind of just wanted to highlight the important points of the Iowa code that pertains to my program and the State Archaeologist Office. And the biggest is that all human remains are protected regardless of antiquity or ancestry. So we work a lot with, again, descendant communities of both Native and non-Native groups to make sure that those sites are protected and preserved in the way that everyone feels is right. You can go to the next slide. One of the things that I wanted to speak to about Iowa code and also kind of how it's influenced federal legislation is that the Iowa laws were really forward thinking. The founders you're seeing in the top right corner, Suzanne's dad, Don Wanatee on the left, and Maria Pearson on the far right. This is a photo with Governor Robert Ray, basically when they passed the 1976 legislation. And it was, very forward thinking in that they wrote into the code that there has to be a balance of both Native perspective and scientific inquiry. So human osteologist was required to be employed in any inadvertent discoveries or burial site investigations, but we are also required to have an Indian Advisory Council. So it was one of those very forward-thinking early laws that made us responsible to Native communities and made us have to communicate and collaborate with Native populations. The other photos here below that are a fairly recent rendition of our Indian Advisory Council. It's changed a lot since then, and we need a new picture, I think. And then on the bottom left corner is my predecessor, Shirley Shermer, who was in this position that I am up until 2014. And then up top, very recent Tribal Summit event where I think from that event, we learned that this communication and collaboration that has been ongoing as part of the Iowa Code is very much stronger even now today. So it's going to continue that way for a good while, I think. One of the other things I wanted to point out was that the Iowa Code was also very a good example for the federal legislation, NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. If you can go to the next slide. And it was the first time that, again, it required consultation with tribes. So dealing with collections acquired when archaeologists really didn't see human remains as ancestors is never easy, but a lot of collections today are that way. Lots of institutions have lots of human remains collections where a lot of grave robbing, looting produce them. And that kind of activity and collecting massive amounts of human remains was sanctioned by the federal government and numerous other agencies and institutions. And so NAGPRO was kind of a way to not necessarily put make institutions responsible and accountable for that activity. And really requiring communication was important because that's the strong base you need to move forward in the right way with those kinds of collections. So having that strong base of transparency and communication is what you need to build trust, and in order to then work towards the proper treatment of those collections. So NAGPRO was really the first time that institutions had a federal mandate to report their collections to tribes, consult with the Senate communities, and mostly consider and incorporate Native perspectives in identifying not just human remains in their collections, but items that, like Suzanne was mentioning, were disassociated from ancestors. And so, yeah, I just for this slide, wanted to highlight that it's been a major shift in archaeology, especially here in Iowa, where early on a lot of mound site investigations, which are burial mounds, involved full excavation of those mounds and disinterment of human remains and a lot of funerary objects, a lot of negative impacts to these sacred burial sites, essentially. It's a double-edged sword. We learned a whole lot about the past from that activity, but it was very destructive. Technologically, we're able to do a lot more even than with excavation now with technology like GPR and ground penetrating radar, gradiometry, resistivity. This slide is showing a really cool article that Colin Betts, who's with Luther College, just produced in the Iowa Archaeological Society journal. And it's showing two different technologies on the right there, gradiometry and I think resistivity on the bottom, where he was able to really see the outline of those bird effigies that are shown in an aerial on the left side there. And he can even pick out differences in soil, texture, color, other features that were surrounding those mounds. And so really got a really amazing pictures of the footprint of those really intricately made features.
I think it, oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say, Laura, I think it's very interesting that even you have a modern day example of a lesson learned on working on a site and the approaches or requirements that would be needed to do that. I know that, for example, at the Field Museum, they're using CT scanning with mummies now, more recently in recent years. And so that they don't destroy or change any aspect of a particular mummy, for example. So it's really interesting what technology has enabled. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
To do this in a more obviously in a more ethical way, but also even still lessons continue to be learned. And museums as well, I think, are learning in this process of how they discuss and talk about objects from Native American heritage, or especially if it has to do with the way we might represent or talk about them or showcase them even. And so that's something that museums continue to work on. I think, Suzanne, go ahead. You wanted to add to that?
Yes, I'd like to add that this also helps us protect this site. While it helps us learn a little bit more from a perspective of a Native American perspective, the value to me is we have evidence that this is something unusual. You see things in South America, different countries of these large. How large would you say these are, Laura? They're not small.
No,
they're probably 100 feet wingtip to wingtip.
Right. So this is a significant shape that's been intentionally put here. And I think from our perspective, knowing that it's there having this science helps us preserve this. It is now not likely to get further degraded, sold off, and someone accidentally put a parking lot on top of it and say, oh, we didn't know it's there. Part of the benefit of the science. Not all Native Americans are against all science. Like I tried to say just in the start, a lot of our world is science-based. We're not anti-science. We do think there's a limit on how much studying you can do with things like human remains and things like that, because there's, science comes in handy at times like this. And I don't know of many Native American tribes that would be opposed to doing this, especially if it helped increase the likelihood that these sites would be kept safe.
Mhm.
I think another layer that we can peel back on using this particular example is that Colin went about his research in a very thoughtful manner. 30, 50, 100 years ago, an archaeologist would have gotten a bright idea to go do something like this, grabbed their technology, gone out and just done it, and then reported it to the archaeological world. Colin had a plan. He knew what he wanted to do, but he then approached my office in order to get in front of the Indian Advisory Council that advises us, and ask if he could present his plan to that council for their feedback. There were some ideas that tweaked the research plan a little bit, but basically it was a collaborative step rather than an after the fact, hey, isn't it great that I did this? And that's another hallmark of how archaeology is changing in the modern world to being far more collaborative than it is just, oh, I'm an archaeologist, I know all about the past and I'll tell you what it was about. So that's a big shift.
I would just add to that another kind of trend in archaeology as far as changes towards wanting to preserve more than just full excavation and just fully investigate a whole area has been just more judicious excavations in the first place. Again, like John said, in collaboration with Native communities, not just at will, and really having to have a, ethical responsibility towards having a good research or good research reason to be doing that. There has to be a really good, I guess, what the word I'm looking for is just a good reason for doing that kind of work, and not just full excavation, but really focusing in on minimal testing that will answer your question.
Caroline, I know we're almost out of time. Could we
Yes.
show the slide about the program on Saturday that's coming up?
Oh, yes. So I do. Thank you. So just FYI, Laura's gonna put in a couple of links that you can learn more information, because we did want to share that, like the Meskwaki Nation site and the Office of the State Archaeologist. And we have a few events that we want to announce. John is mentioning, again, ways that you can engage and learn more on the site. This is one event coming up. John, go ahead.
Yeah. So actually, Suzanne will be there too. She and I and some of our colleagues will be up in Elgin, Iowa, working on the first of several events connected with a grant that the University of Iowa has sponsored. It's called Community Engaged Scholarship, but what it's really about is collaboration with both descendant communities like the Meskwaki, but also then with Iowa communities like Elgin and the folks at the Elgin Historical Society, who are very keen to learn more about the archaeology of their area in particular, and to help preserve it and help communicate its importance to local folks. So we're doing what's called an Archeo Blitz. We're going to have a couple presentations. Jonathan and Suzanne will be doing a presentation. Bill Quackenbush with the Ho-Chunk will also do a presentation, but we'll have an opportunity for people to bring in artifacts that they've collected from their family farms, share those with us to learn about them and how to care for them, but also to get them on that Iowa site file that we talked about, so that they're part of the record and not just lost in somebody's basement or in a box on a shelf someplace. So we're very excited about this.
Thank you, John, and happy Archaeology Month in Iowa, correct?
Yes, that's right.
So this is part of that. Just a few quick announcements, and I do have a question from the Q&A, so I want to share that. If you can stay a few minutes, we welcome people, but we understand if you can't, that's fine. This is being recorded and we will share that out. So just FYI, in addition to sort of thinking of, I love this idea of open systems, Suzanne, and Lara, you kind of ended that idea of like, we have an open system now of communication, relationship building, and science education and knowledge and work. So in that, you know, we are also trying to do that here at the Pentacrest Museums. I have one last tree tour in which I talk about from many different worldviews, including Indigenous views, of our relationship with trees. So please come to that. That's going to be at this Friday. It's the last one of the season. I'm hoping to do more in the future. And also just thinking of our health and wellness, we're going to be at the next Staff and Faculty Health Wellbeing Fair, which I will talk about the tree tours and talk about ways that we can connect more with our land, connect more with people, connect with our collections in mindful and healthful ways. So just FYI on those events. And now for the Q&A, we do have a question and I'm going to share it. Somebody asks, do you think we can ever have full reparations? And I'm going to stop sharing so that we can see everybody more up close for this part of the session. Who would like to go first and answer?
I'll just quickly jump in and I'm gonna just say probably not, because we have a lot of work to do still. I know from just colleagues in other institutions and other collections that I know of, we still have a long way to go.
I guess I'll follow that, and Suzanne can have the last word. So repatriations have come a long ways in the last 20 years, and I think we're making great progress on that. There's institutions who are finally participating in their NAGPRA responsibilities who have put it off for 30 years. Indiana and Illinois in particular jump out as two states that are finally getting it together, catching up with what we've been doing in Iowa. So full repatriations, I think, are on the horizon, are an achievable target. Repatriations, though, of the kinds of genocidal actions and economic deprivations that Suzanne referenced in her part, that's a big hill to climb, and we'll see. You know, the land acknowledgement that the University of Iowa put together and the offer of in-state tuition for members of those communities that's a tiny, tiny step. It's a good one, but it's a very tiny step in the bigger picture. Suzanne?
Yeah, it's I'd like to say that when it comes to consultation with these federal laws, many Native Americans want to have a meaningful consultation, not just, well, we met on this day at this time and, you know, didn't like what the Indians had to say, so we went ahead and moved along with our own plans. But that to us isn't meaningful consultation. And from our perspective, I think what we're doing now is many Native Americans see meaningful consultation as having a continuing dialogue. I believe at this point, and we're a number of decades into it now, we are engaging in meaningful dialogue. We have a direct relationship now with policymakers and people who have the responsibility of overseeing many things that have happened in the past that have resulted in these collections here in Iowa and elsewhere in the United States. So I think that from a Native American perspective, from my perspective anyway, is to keep doing more of the same. And we've raised the bar. The bar has been raised to not acknowledging Indians at all, to now understanding that they're a necessary partner, and having tribes as necessary partners in a meaningful way actually improves the lives, history, knowledge base, and science of everyone. So we all improve each other's lives by being in each other's lives. And I think from this point forward, I believe that at least in Iowa anyway, I see the commitment for that to keep going. And that makes me hopeful for even more in the future.
That's wonderful to hear, Suzanne. I thank you very much, all of you. I do have one last question in relation to the future, kind of current and future. As the field has changed so much in terms of how relationships and discussions, conversations, collaborations are made between, say, the Office of State Archaeologist and Indigenous communities. What are ways, because I hear education is also important in this, what are ways that we're connecting to the next generation of both archaeologists and of those that are interested in getting into the field, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous? What does that look like in your communities? Say, being in the university here at OSA and the communities, and Suzanne, from your perspective as a Meskwaki tribal member.
I believe 30 years ago, it was almost unheard of for Native Americans to go into the field because the field was seen as the enemy. And I believe now the opportunities for minorities, people of color, women, I don't know what the numbers are at OSA, but there's a high number of female leadership there at OSA, whether it's the education, whether it's the, boots on the ground work being done, policy making. And I believe that has improved the level of trust that we have. If I go to an institution and I see the same old people that were there a number of years ago, there doesn't seem to be much forward movement in including different voices within their organization, it's not likely that they're going to let my voice in either. So I think what I look at is the institution. Are they trying to retain? Are they trying to promote females, minorities, Native Americans? Are they trying to attract them? Are there tenured positions? How vulnerable are the agencies in charge of this? Are they always subject to budget cuts and told, oh, you guys aren't that important? Then I would wonder about the commitment of that institution. So we do look at what else the institution is doing. And in the field of study, I do encourage Native Americans to go into the field of archaeology because I think it does improve our understanding and improve the discipline itself. Our voices do need to be in there, but I think it's also the being in the institution, expecting more from your educational institutions, from your government agencies that have this responsibility. Be on the committee, show up to meetings, read material that's there, knock on the door, ask, what do you do? And these people who love their jobs and who want to promote the profession, if they want you in there, they're going to open the door. They're going to be glad to see you. And so I say it now, it's a better opportunity for minorities and women than what it has been in the past.
I think, if I may, I want to agree with that as a minority and as a woman of Indigenous heritage. I think that's one thing that I've been grateful to the University of Iowa for. We have the Native American Council, which I'm on, and I'm also on the Latino Council. So providing sort of a space for people to get into leadership or to really be that voice is so, so important. And I also recognize the folks at the NAC for what they're trying to do. They have a summer program, for example, for young people to learn about careers here at the university. It's the First Nations program, and I think it's incredible that we have that, and we need to grow that, and we need to be more visible. And I know other cultural centers on campus are also trying to be that voice, but we also depend on our allies. So that's another area of growth that I'm hoping to see happen. So thank you, Suzanne, for that. John or Laura, do you want to make any last minute comments on this before we end our session?
I guess I'd offer that from my perspective, the world of professional archaeology is split into three sectors. Those who are in academic positions and teach classes and work with undergraduates and graduate students. Those who are in the agency, state, federal, even in some places, other units of government, who are more in the regulation of cultural resources, including archaeological sites. And then there are those who are in the consulting world who make a living doing archaeological consulting work, usually in compliance kinds of contexts. The OSA at the University of Iowa is kind of unique, not absolutely so, but it's unusual that we do all three of those things. We're based at a university. Laura and I both have adjunct status in the anthropology department. We do some
Mm.
teaching. We do incorporate students in our activities here as we are able. And we do lots of consulting work. Our major economic engine is our research program that provides compliance archaeology for those who will pay us to do it. And that allows us to have 20 archaeologists on staff here and have a very robust presence on all fronts, particularly our public facing front. So our positioning here has been very beneficial for Iowa archaeology. Not all states have this arrangement, so it's a really good one. But that means that we do have a responsibility to try to influence the discipline as a whole. And Laura and I have both done that through our teaching. Laura is teaching a course right now that she does every fall. You want to talk about that course a little bit?
Sure. Just it's a first year seminar, so all first years have opportunities to join a really big variety of first year seminars here at the University of Iowa. And the one I do is just an intro to biological anthropology, but I definitely build in a lot of what we were talking about today, where we go over the Iowa laws and we talk about kind of the history of those, and first and foremost, that respectful treatment of Native American all remains, all human remains is really important. And I do see definitely increased diversity in those classes, just kind of kids from all over and lots of different backgrounds. And I know that at least a couple usually every year get pushed into anthropology. So I try to do what we can with the students that come through, for sure.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank everybody that's here. I'm very humbled and honored that you could take your time, each and every one of you. Suzanne, coming from a conference and in a hotel room, thank you so much. And John, you're just behind the rainbow. So that gives me a lot of hope for the future as far as our open system is concerned. We will stop the recording, but we're glad that you came. And if you have any further questions, we could provide our emails for those that want to, and you can follow up with questions there, but look for the video recording. Thanks again for coming.